Hello and welcome to Australian Geographic's Ask an Expert. I'm here today with Professor Dr. Richard Shine, who will be talking to us all about lizards. So thank you so much for joining us, Rick. Do you want to tell us a little bit about your title and also your love for lizards?
My title is simply the fact that I did a couple of doctoral degrees, and so in some parts of the world one is called then Professor Doctor. I was one of these miserable small children that loved lizards since I was just tiny. I used to bring blue tongues to school, and I had the incredible privilege of having a career as a research scientist working with reptiles. So I've done lots of research projects on lots of kinds of lizards across Australia.
Amazing. So you're perfect to have on air to talk all about them. We have some questions from our viewers. They can also submit some questions throughout the live stream. So our socials should be coming up on the screen shortly. Give us a follow if you're not already. Otherwise, this is your chance to ask some extra questions of Rick. But if we're ready, maybe we'll jump right in with the first question.
Absolutely.
Perfect. So, from Instagram, Will Ford would like to know how many different species of lizards are found in Australia?
That's a much tougher question than you might think, because we don't really know. The more research people do, particularly looking at genetic characteristics, they often discover that what we thought was a single species that's widely distributed actually consists of 3 or 4 or even a dozen different species that are actually quite separate. And so they have to get their own names. So we know there's more than 800 species within Australia of lizards.
That's a good amount of lizards.
That's a lot of lizards. There's only 3,500–4,000 lizards in the whole world, so on our planet. So Australia is the land of lizards.
Perfect. I wouldn't want to be anywhere else. So we're wondering, John Boy would like to know, what is the biggest native lizard?
The goannas, or the monitor lizards, or varanids, are the biggest of our lizards, and there's a species in the desert called the parenti that can get to almost 3 metres long.
Wow.
So it's a very big lizard. If you'd been around here about 100,000 years ago, though, Komodo dragons actually evolved in Australia.
Amazing.
And there's a lot of fossil record of them up in tropical Australia. Now, they're only found now on some Indonesian islands, but there was a time when we had much larger lizards, even bigger than Komodos.
Amazing. So what I'm hearing is that the dangerous lizards have left Australia, which is unlike the rest of our wildlife, right?
Indeed.
Speaking of species of lizards, Lysiane would like to know, how many species of blue-tongue lizard are there?
Again, you sort of run into problems with our difficulty of saying exactly what is a species and what's separate. There's about 6 species, but you can add an extra one from New Guinea that probably gets to the Torres Strait Islands, so it's kind of an Australian. And I'm doing some work with some colleagues showing that a subspecies, the tropical common blue tongue, is actually quite a separate species from the common blue tongue on the east coast. So you can add an extra one into the mix there, which we haven't quite got round to publishing yet.
That's a bit
So
exciting.
it's something like half a dozen, but we'll probably end up with 7 or 8 at least before long.
That sounds good. I'd like some extra blue tongues. We've got a question from Wendy Rend, who would like to know, why do frillneck lizards have frilled necks and how do they work?
Absolutely. So one of the first projects that I did up on the tropics, and this is 20 years ago now or more, frillies were quite common, and nobody had ever really worked out what the heck they used their frill for. A lot of lizards display to each other. So if 2 territorial males, they meet each other, they'll start doing head bobs and waving their arms and showing off colours and things like that. And I thought probably that's what frillies were using it for, but I was wrong. What male frillies do is they do non-directed displays. They get out there on a tree in the open and they start flapping their frill and lashing their tail, and the frillies have got terrific eyesight. So even if another male is 100 metres away, he sees that happening and he knows that he's not allowed to get into that territory.
Crazy. That's very cool. Do they have anything to do with, like, you know, so is it just for kind of a display, or can it be intimidation, or even if they're like hot, do they pull them back or anything like that?
Yeah, there were lots of stories around. My favourite one was that it's an umbrella that they put out when it rains, or that they store food in the folds of the frill. But no, they do use it against predators, so that if a bird or a dog or something is going to attack them, they can make themselves look terrifying. They open the mouth, they erect the frill, they look like this big giant thing, they stand up on their hind legs and they'll actually bounced towards you like a kangaroo. Yeah, so the frill's got multi-purposes, but mostly it's about the boys telling other boys to keep their distance.
Yeah, well, got to find a way to do it somehow. From Instagram, we'd like to know, are eastern bearded dragons in decline? Because we see a lot less than we used to.
This is one of these things that I've heard from a number of people, and it's my own experience as well. When I was a kid around Sydney, it wasn't all that unusual to find a bearded dragon. I haven't seen one now for several years. So I think it's true that that's a species that is genuinely in decline. Sadly, we have very little in the way of really thorough population surveys that would put numbers on that. But I think most of us believe that for some reason, and we don't really understand it, the eastern bearded dragon is in trouble, whereas the bearded dragons in some other parts of Australia, different species, are actually doing pretty well.
Huh, so we're not quite sure what the issue is there yet.
It's probably about habitat destruction, dogs, motor cars running them over, that kind of thing, but we're not 100% sure.
Interesting. Lady Sharona the First would like to know, and hopefully you know what she's talking about with these, how are those tiny endangered trapdoor type burrowing lizards going? She thinks they live in desert areas. I cannot identify these, can you?
I think she's probably thinking about the pygmy bluetongue. It's a member of the bluetongue genus, but it's a tiny little animal, and it actually has a pink tongue instead of a blue tongue. It was only rediscovered recently when somebody found a road-killed brown snake, cut it open and found the lizard in its stomach, and we knew that this lizard that was supposed to have gone extinct was actually still alive, and that's when we found out it had a pink tongue.
Incredible.
They're not doing too badly. They're in the area around Adelaide, in the grasslands, but they're only in the areas where we still have native grasses. And there's not much of that now because farmers have planted exotic grasses that have higher productivity. The stock like them more, but the lizards don't like them at all. But there's really intensive efforts going now to conserve those populations, and I think the future's looking pretty good for the pygmy bluetongue.
Awesome. Well, that's good news. Sharona should be happy to hear.
Yeah.
So, how and why do lizards drop their tails?
It's a defence against predators, and you know you can actually see it out there in your backyard. If you're lucky enough to live in Australia, in places where you have lizards in your backyard. Most parts of the world don't have that. But the penny lizards, the little garden skinks in my backyard, if they're being chased by a magpie, and the magpie is likely to get their tail because it's the last bit, it's the closest bit to them, the lizard has special planes in the tail between the vertebrae that enable it to snap off.
Wow.
And of course the bit that breaks off flaps around, and so it distracts the predator and it enables the lizard to have a chance to get away. If the predator doesn't eat it, the lizard will often come back the next day and actually eat that little bit of its own tail.
Bit of extra nutrients?
Yeah, so it doesn't waste the tail that it's dropped.
That's very interesting. So if you find a dropped one, you'll be able to find a lizard there shortly after, hopefully.
Well, you have to wait for a while perhaps, but yeah.
And so how does it work exactly when they drop it? Is it, you know, how do they sever their own limb, really?
Yeah, so there are special fracture planes within the tail. And you might expect it to go between the different vertebrae, the backbone elements in the tail, but in fact it goes right through the middle of a vertebrae, so it's designed to break. The lizard can contract really powerful muscles in the tail that actually snaps that tail in two. Wow. Yeah, it's a pretty phenomenal trick.
That is amazing. Yeah. So how long will it take for a lizard to then regrow its tail?
Well, time's kind of a different concept for a lizard than it is for us, because lizards spend a lot of their time doing very little, and especially in a cold climate, a lizard might sit under a rock for months at a time in winter, and so there's not going to be very much tail growth going on then. But typically they take a few months to regrow. They're often a little bit secretive at that time. They often can't run quite as quickly or as athletically. The girls may decide not to go ahead and have eggs that year and wait until they've regrown their tail before they start reproducing again. That makes sense. Need to get the energy back up. And can all lizards drop their tails? No, there's a lot of lizards that can't. The big goannas, most of the dragons. There's one dragon, the water dragon, that's quite common in Sydney and other parts of the east coast of Australia, that can regrow their tail a bit. They really need that tail to swim. Yeah. So I guess evolution has pushed them towards having a regrowing tail, whereas other things like bearded dragons don't need the tail quite so much, and so they don't regrow it. So it's here and there with different species.
Cool, that's very cool. Jane Hocking would like to know, do lizards see in black and white or in colour?
Lizards have got pretty damn good colour vision.
Really?
And you see, when you look at many lizards, they actually have patches of colour that are used in social displays. The most dramatic ones are the males that might have a bright red chest, like the water dragons, or blue patches on their necks and things like that. In some lizards, the females, when they become pregnant, actually produce bright colours along their side that send a message to the guys that, hey, look, you know, I'm not interested in mating, I'm going ahead and having a family, stay away from me.
I mean, that's one way to tell them, right? Cute. So Jane would also like to know, is it true that some types of lizards can go their whole life without drinking water? And if so, how do they survive?
Yeah, look, lizards, like many reptiles, are really good at surviving with very little energy. And so places like deserts are very good for them. In deserts, quite often there's no rainfall for long periods of time, maybe for a year, and so an animal that can survive without drinking gets a huge advantage. What most of these guys do is they look for moist soil. So a thorny devil, for example, this little spiky guy that you find out near Alice Springs, will go and sit on damp soil, and the scales of the lizard have little channels in, and so the water actually seeps up along those channels and moves to the corner of the lizard's mouth, and he can suck it in. So he doesn't actually drink, the water comes to him from the moist soil.
That is incredible. That's very, very cool. We have a question from Kale Del Allen, who would like to know, he says he's heard that shingleback lizards mate for life. Is this true?
Yeah, look, there's been some beautiful long-term research by a guy called Mike Bull out of Adelaide. And what Mike discovered, he went out there every year, year after year, catching lizards, giving them individual marks, and so on. And with shinglebacks, sleepy lizards, there's this period in spring where you find the female walking across the road and there'll be a male right behind her, often with actually tongue flicking her tail, just walking with her. And they'll stay together for weeks. And what Mike noticed was that you get the same boy and the same girl together year after year after year.
That's very sweet.
I think his record was 21 years for one couple. Mike died before the study could go any longer, but the chances are that boy and that girl are still looking for each other because shinglebacks live a long time.
Yeah.
You know, there's occasional divorce, there's occasional bigamy, but broadly, shinglebacks are the only known monogamous reptile.
That's gorgeous. And is there kind of an evolutionary reason for this?
There's been some interesting speculation about it. It seems that if you find a compatible mate, that's really worth staying with. And so it could be about chemicals and immune responses and so on. There are suggestions about parasite tolerance, and you really only want to hang around a lot with a lizard that has the same immune system as you do. You can get rid of the same parasites and so on. I think it's still a question mark, but it's an extraordinarily powerful phenomenon.
That's amazing. And is it true that they do kind of co-parenting together? Is that a phenomenon?
No, there's not. There is parental care in a bunch of related species. There are lizards that live in the highlands near Sydney, the black rock skinks, where mum and dad have a crevice in the rocks and they raise the kids there. And the neighbours are homicidal. These are very aggressive lizards, and so if mum and dad don't take care of the kids, they might well be eaten by the guy that lives next door. But so they live there with the parents for years, and the parents raise them up. We don't see that with shinglebacks. The kids seem to disappear and head off for their own lives not long after they're born. Mum and dad really only spend a lot of time together during that spring period, the mating season.
Yeah, amazing. So there are a lot more lizard relationships and dynamics than we really think about.
Yeah, we've done a bunch of work in the laboratory showing that the lizards can recognise other individuals, for example. They can recognise their own kids and their own mates and things like that, but there's definitely clear individual recognition. It's not just another lizard, you know, that one's Harry and that one's George.
They all know each other by name. Shannon Callets would like to know, what is your prediction for how long it will be until shinglebacks are extinct? Are they endangered or...?
I'm pretty optimistic about shinglebacks. I mean, the reality is that Australian biodiversity is in crisis.
Yeah.
We are losing species. We have, for example, lost a lot of frogs due to an invasive fungus. Most species are probably decreasing in numbers, but there's a small number of species that actually tolerate human disturbance very well, and they actually benefit from it. And shinglebacks are probably in that category. They're hanging around the suburbs in Canberra. They're very abundant in a lot of the agricultural country. And so I'm kind of thinking we're going to have shinglebacks with us for a heck of a long time. We might lose local populations with inappropriate development and destruction of habitat, but broadly, the shinglebacks are survivors.
Good, I like to hear that. And so Dane V would like to know from YouTube, thank you for watching, Dane, what is the most common legless lizard species in New South Wales?
Oh boy, that's a tough one. It very much depends where you are. A lot of those species are distributed in quite small areas, and knowing the total numbers is difficult because some of them, for example, are sort of worm-like creatures that live under rocks.
Wow.
And you really only see them if you turn over rocks or if it rains a lot and they get pushed out by the water. I would guess that the most common are probably either the common scaly foot, which is sort of a creature that moves around at dusk and looks for spiders. It eats big funnel webs and so on.
Yeah. Is that an ironic name for not having legs?
Well, they have feet. I mean, the legless lizards are not totally legless. They have little flaps. They're often called flat-footed lizards. And so they're the vestiges of hind limbs. They've completely lost the front ones, but they still have these little flaps at the back that they use probably for moving around a bit and things like that. But there's another one, the Burton's legless lizard, that's one of my favourites, that's got a really long nose, and it's evolved to be an ambush predator that eats other lizards. It's like a miniature death adder. It's an extraordinary beast that has evolved a totally different way of life.
That's amazing. How big can these guys get?
That would be a really big Burton's legless lizard. I've seen them a little bit bigger, but not very often. But they eat quite big skinks. They have hinged teeth so that their teeth can penetrate the scales or the skin between the scales in the lizards they eat. And they've got a whole range of behavioural modifications that enable them to be really effective ambush predators.
Wow, okay, so they're the, scary lizard that lizards tell their kids to keep away from, I assume. Horror stories, make sure you behave, otherwise.
They're a little small to be scary, but they are truly beautiful.
Yeah, they sound incredible. So here's a good question to follow up. Ben Griffiths would like to know, what is the difference between a lizard and a snake?
Yeah, look, lizards and snakes are really closely related. And so, evolutionarily, we started out with lizards. They had 4 decent-sized legs and so forth. And many different groups of lizards have actually lost their legs. And they swim through the soil, and there are various degrees of limb reduction. Some of them have got back legs but no front legs. Some of them have got 5 toes, some 4, some 3, some 2, some 1. So there are many different groups of legless lizards, but one of those groups is the snakes, and that's been the huge success story.
Yeah.
So the differences are things like lizards have external ears and snakes don't. Lizards tend to have broad fleshy tongues, and snakes have got the forked tongue. Lizards tend to have some evidence of limbs and often have quite long tails. Snakes don't have any external evidence of limbs, apart from little spurs in pythons, and they have short tails.
Amazing. So if, say, I was looking at something that I thought could be a legless lizard or a snake, would I be looking at its tongue, or how would you go about
I'd look for an obvious external ear. The tongue would certainly give it away. Unless, of course, I'd found a goanna, because they have long forked tongues like snakes. So it's a combination of characters. It's just really one special group of legless lizards that we call snakes, because they've been such a huge success story across the globe.
They get their own name, recognition. Love it. So yes, Sean was asking, what are legless lizards? I think we've kind of gone over that. They either have little legs or they're a snake.
Yeah, so that, there are these multiple groups. So a lot of the skinks, the shiny, smooth scaled animals, a lot of legless skinks, but the main legless lizard group, that includes the Burton's legless lizard and the common scalyfoot, are actually modified geckos.
Oh wow!
Yeah, so all geckos look pretty much like normal lizards. They've got normal shaped bodies and tails and 4 legs, But in Australia, this one group of geckos lost their legs and it turned into the pygopodid legless lizards.
Wow, so they must have done pretty well then.
Yeah, well, they're right across the country. They're relatively common. They used to be, I think, probably much more abundant several million years ago. So they're the shrinking remnant of what was a fantastic success story, but there's still a heck of a lot of them out there.
Amazing, that's so interesting. We've also got a question from Rick Ramada on Instagram. He would like to know if there are any unique adaptions lizards in Australia have undergone as a result of the isolation in Australia.
Our Australian lizards are incredibly distinctive in many cases. We've got all these spectacular animals. We have so many lizards. It really is true that in zoological circles, Australia is known as the land of lizards.
Love it.
You can get 30 species in an area the size of your living room living out in the desert near Alice Springs. So I don't think there's anything that's absolutely sort of ochre, unique, true blue Australian. Maybe the fact that they have evolved to deal with the venoms of some of the Australian snakes, that wouldn't be seen in lizards from other countries. But broadly we see lots of similar general directions of evolution in Australian lizards, but the end results are distinctly Australian.
All these very different, very amazing lizards. And then Eric would like to know, are there any specifications to Australian lizards like there are for Australian mammals?
I don't think there's anything that you can put your finger on as absolutely distinct. Lizards, for example, are very good at crossing barriers and getting to different places. So geckos, the Australian geckos have actually reached Australia multiple times. So we've got several different groups of geckos that have all come separately, and they're closely related to geckos from other parts of the world. So you really wouldn't see a distinctly Australian characteristic that you could identify as you probably could with the marsupials.
And I guess that's interesting, yes. I guess that's interesting because we have so many that it'd be hard to kind of put a finger on it when they're all so individual. Now, Coral Osborne would like to know, does Australia have any dangerous lizards?
Not unless you're very small. You know, the big goannas are formidable animals. You certainly don't want to get bitten by them. They are technically venomous. They do produce a certain amount of venom that they can deliver in a bite, but it's a very small amount. So really for human beings, no. You know, if you're an insect, absolutely.
Be
they're
terrified.
terribly dangerous. If you're another lizard. But if you're a human being, no, the Australian lizards are all sweethearts.
Love it. So look, don't touch, leave them to their own accord, but they'll be nice. Beautiful. Jane Elise would like to know, why do lizards enjoy basking in the sun?
Lizards and snakes are ectotherms. And ecto means from outside and therm is temperature. So they control their temperature by external heat sources, and basking in the sun is a terrifically efficient way to get warm. It's much more efficient than the way that we do it. We burn up energy in our food. We waste 90% of the energy in the food we eat just keeping warm.
Wow.
Yeah, so a lizard, our weight, would have to eat less than 10% of the amount we'd have to eat. So it's incredibly efficient. And if you live in a hot climate and you can get warm whenever you want to by just going out into the sun, it's a really good energy saving trick. Amazing.
So you can just go out and bask and feel reinvigorated.
Indeed.
Love that. They're like, what was I going to say, like solar powered.
Indeed, they're little mobile solar panels.
Gorgeous. Tori would like to know, how long are lizards pregnant for and how many babies can they have at one time?
Okay, we've got so many different types of lizards that it's incredibly variable, and even within a group. So the shinglebacks and the blue tongues are very closely related, and they're about the same size. And a female blue tongue in Sydney will have about 20 babies.
Wow.
Very small babies. And a shingleback will have 2 very large ones.
Okay.
So there's a huge difference in the size and the number of kids they have. Time of pregnancy, it depends on climate. In a warm climate, an egg layer might only hold the eggs in her oviduct for about a month. A live bearer might be 2 months, maybe 3. But I was at a conference talk just a couple of weeks ago about a New Zealand gecko that lives in a very cold climate, and they had a female there that was pregnant for at least 2 years.
Wow.
Before she gave birth. So if it's cold enough, the embryos develop slowly. everything stretches out.
That makes sense. And more lizards live birth or eggs, or is it fairly similarly distributed?
Most species are egg layers, but live bearing has evolved about 50 times within lizards, sometimes even within a single species.
Wow.
And Australia is the place where this has happened more than anything else. So we have a few species within Australia where some populations in some areas lay eggs, and the same species, other populations in different areas, produce live young.
That's incredible. So I guess it's where you are.
Yeah, it's mostly cold climates. If you go into a really cold area, you can't find a warm nest site where your eggs can develop. But if mum keeps the eggs inside her, she can go and bask in the sun, and so she can keep the babies warm.
Perfect.
And so live bearing pays off if the climate's cold.
Yeah, because then you can go send the kids out to go lay in the sun as well. Maddie Newberry, she's got 2 questions for us. The first one is, which lizard populations have been most impacted by cats?
Again, look, I think we don't know, but it's clear that many species of lizards and other small wildlife are very badly affected by cats.
Yeah.
That's true in suburban habitats, but it's also true way out in the middle of nowhere. I mean, cats have proven to be incredibly good at colonising really harsh environments, including the desert, and it's obvious that they eat vast numbers of lizards. So, you know, the ones we worry about are the endangered species, but the cats are a huge problem.
Yeah, so I guess it's good advice to, you know, keep your cats safe, happy indoors or in a little enclosure outside.
Yeah, look, absolutely. Cats are beautiful animals. I understand why people want to have them as pets, but really letting them out loose to roam around and kill native animals, I think, is a very poor strategy.
Yeah, I agree. So Maddie would also like to know, is changing climate affecting the distribution of lizard species?
You know, changing climate is rewriting the rule book. So that, for example, one of the problems in the high elevation areas in the Alps is that the lizards that depend on very cold conditions, those conditions just don't occur anymore except at the very top of the mountain. So the climate change may be benefiting species that like it to be warm. They're moving up the mountain, but it's not leaving much space for the guys at the top. Right. So we're certainly seeing changes in the distribution of lizards. We're seeing changes in their activity seasons, their reproductive seasons, things like this. There's even some data with bearded dragon showing it changes the way that the sex of a lizard is determined.
Wow.
If you get really hot weather, the lizards have got sex chromosomes, but that is overridden by hot temperatures so that the eggs that were genetically male will hatch as females.
Amazing.
So yeah, climate change is having a big effect.
Yeah, so is the eggs, I guess, changing then, like the embryos changing, is that kind of similar to how in sea turtles as well when it's...
Yes, so normally we say that sex is determined either by your genes or by the environment, particularly the temperature of the nest.
Yeah.
What we've discovered with a few species of Australian lizards is that in fact it can be a combination of the two.
Wow.
You can have sex chromosomes, but if the temperatures get too extreme, that takes over. And that overrides the genetic message, and so you get a sex-reversed individual that has the genes you'd expect in one sex, but in fact, functionally, it's the other sex.
Amazing, that's really interesting. And then Shannon would like to know, and I apologise if I mispronounce this, what is being done to control the spread of Nannizziopsis?
Okay, yeah, this is one of several funguses that are causing a lot of concern. All around the world, we've seen the spread of various kinds of fungus. The famous one is chytrid fungus that is killing amphibians. There's one frog fungus and there's a salamander fungus in the northern hemisphere. Many species are being driven to extinction. It was brought in many years ago to Australia from Southeast Asia. It has spread and many of our frogs can't deal with it. So the story is similar but a bit less extreme with the reptile funguses. We don't yet know where many of them came from. We know that we see them in captivity. We know that we find animals in the wild that have got them. We know it can be devastating. The fungus can erode the skin and it's pretty awful stuff.
Yeah.
I guess the current thinking is that stressed individuals are more susceptible. In the same way that we get sick if we're stressed, lizards that get stressed, their immune systems are not fighting the fungus as effectively. climate change is probably making it a bit harder still. And so I think it's just watch this space. The fungus is there. People are trying to understand how it got there and what it's doing.
Yep.
But it could turn into a disaster story.
All right, so it's something we've got to keep an eye on then.
Yeah.
Elism would like to know, how can we make our yards more hospitable for lizards? How can we welcome lizards into our lives?
Great question. I think it's mostly about not having a cat, or probably a dog, depending on the dog, running around. If you do have predators, and there's lots of birds that eat lizards and so on, really lots of cover is the key. Lizards hate big open expanses of lawn where they can't hide. They're in trouble. So really you're looking for mulch, vegetation, some rocks to provide a few hot spots as well as some cool spots so that they can choose. If you can get a bit of water into the system, you'll probably have more insects and more thick vegetation that lizards can hide in. So I think it's just generally trying to think like a lizard, providing a diversity of places to hide, places to live their lives.
Amazing. Just got to make a little home for them in our home.
Absolutely. And they'll take advantage of it.
Perfect.
They'll come in.
We'll get so many more lizards now.
Build it and they will come.
And then Tom Bates would like to know, how closely related are modern day lizards and dinosaurs?
Yeah, look, that's an interesting one because they look fairly similar. You know, their shape's about the same, and most of them probably had scales, although we now think a lot of dinosaurs probably had some feathers and so on. But in fact, they're very distantly related. There's one group called the archosaurs that has the dinosaurs, the crocodiles and the birds. And there's another group, the squamate reptiles, that has lizards and snakes and so on. And so they actually split many, many millions of years ago. But it was a pretty good body plan, you know, that shape and that covering. And so evolution has maintained it in those two quite different groups.
So it's just a really good design then?
Yeah.
Yeah, amazing. And then Mugwort and Mistletoe would like to know, what are some lizard dreamtime stories?
Oh boy. Lizards appear in many First Nation narratives. I guess I kind of feel that you need permission from those people to tell those stories. I've heard some great stories, I've been told some great stories by First Nation people, but I'm probably not all that keen to try to tell them here.
That is more than okay. I guess we either go to the source, so I'm sure there are lots of amazing online assets as well that we can have a read from. Lucy Robinson would like to know, how long do lizards live on average?
It's just so variable. You know, your little garden skink is not going to live as long as your giant lace monitor. They live a long time, a surprisingly long time. Many of these little lizards potentially can live for a decade. The bigger ones, 20, 30, 40 years. I have a friend who got water dragons when he was a kid, and one of them just died at the age of 45.
Wow.
So given the chance, they can live a long time. Of course, in nature, there's lots of challenges, lots of predators and so forth, and it's unlikely that very many actually reach those sorts of ages.
And we have one more question. Kale is back and he would like to know, Rick, what is your favourite Aussie lizard?
Oh, that's tough. They're all sweethearts. I think if you shone a bright light in my eyes and you said, you know, what's your favourite? I think the shingleback has to be right up there. I mean, Africa, North America, South America, Europe have got desert tortoises. We don't have desert tortoises in Australia, and so one of our lizards essentially evolved ecologically to be a tortoise, this big, slow-moving, heavily armoured creature. And I just think shinglebacks have got so much personality. They're just a genuine Aussie icon.
Yeah, amazing. That's a good choice, I reckon. I'll agree with you on that one. So that is all of our questions. Thank you so much for joining us, Rick. It has been amazing and very insightful. We'll also just say our next issue of the journal is coming out on September 5th, so be sure to keep an eye out for that, and we'll be doing an amazing feature on the Australian Geographic Nature Photographer of the Year. All of the winners will be in there, and we'll also be announcing that online on our website and our socials this coming Friday evening. So keep an eye out for that, and until next time, thank you so much for joining us.